I was interested when you talked about all the redacting of documents, because I remember a few years ago, lots of newspapers were talking about this whole thing about irresponsible dumping, agents' lives put at risk. Is that rubbish?
Well, if you don't believe me, you should believe...
No. I'm not saying yours is rubbish.
Let me finish. You should believe the witness of the government in the Chelsea Manning case, who had to admit under oath that there was no evidence of anybody being physically harmed as a result of this release. And now, 14 years later, we haven't heard of any damage.
Good evening. My name's Vaughan Smith, and as the founder of Frontline Club, I'd like to welcome you here. This isn't the first event we've done about WikiLeaks or Julian Assange. In fact, I think it was nearly something like 13 years ago. Julian knocked on our door and he did a press conference. He knocked on our door on a Friday, and on Monday he had a press conference about the Afghan war logs, which I'm sure all of you will know about. So we started doing events here with him, and then when he was no longer available, we've continued doing events about Julian for all that time. It makes you wonder. I have, I must say, the most huge admiration for Stella, for Jennifer, and for Christian, for all the support they've done for Julian and for WikiLeaks. It's been tireless, and I must say I really admire them, particularly Stella, for this extraordinary... It's hard for most of us to even imagine the stress and the difficulty that every day must be for her, so I'd like to recognise that. Tomorrow, Julian, again, is in court. I'm not entirely sure whether he'll be allowed to be there or he'll be on a video link. It just occurred to me that it's not just Julian that is being scrutinised. I think it's the court that's being scrutinised. Julian is clearly a political prisoner. And it strikes me that in our country today, in this country, there's such a level of civic dishonesty. You have to wonder where that sort of thing comes from. And if the court is being employed, as it is perceived by me to be employed, as a vehicle of lawfare for the powerful, for our political masters, to remove somebody who they feel their voice makes them uncomfortable. This is what perhaps promotes, as much as anything, that sort of dysfunction in our country that we see that's so rapid, what I call civic disorder, the sort of civic dishonesty. Anyway, with that was all I have to think about it, and you're here to listen to me. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Chris Hedges, who will introduce the panel. And thank you very much, all of you, for coming to discuss it.
Thanks, and I just have to say, coming back to London, it's always hard to come back and not see John Pilger. And I just want to mention his name. I was walking by a discount clothing store, I'm embarrassed to admit this, and saw a white linen suit and bought one. My wife said, when are you ever going to, but I did it just to remember in a funny way, John, who could be totally irascible and impossible at the same time, but was an amazing journalist and really got what was happening to Julian from the beginning, and just did not let go with that kind of doggedness and brilliance. And he was a beautiful writer. So I just wanted to mention him as a journalist tonight, that he's kind of here. So I'm not going to butcher your last name, Kristen.
You're welcome to.
Editor-in-Chief of WikiLeaks, Jennifer Robinson, human rights attorney, Stella Assange, you all know, also an attorney. I guess we're gonna run for about an hour and then open it to questions. Maybe we should begin, because even I have questions, with you, Stella, and Jennifer, just from the legal point of view, because the court never tells us anything. So, we all kind of wait, for Deus ex machina to appear out of the sky with some decision. We never know when. But maybe you can, I'll let you start, Jennifer, and then you, Stella, just lay out legally where we are and to the best that you can, what you expect.
Well, first, thank you, Chris. Thank you for your work, and thank you for raising John. And I do think it's appropriate that we do talk about John. And I just want to share a little anecdote about him before we kick off. John was there at the very, very beginning. He was rallying people to post bail for Julian. At the very beginning, he was rallying other Australians in London. We talk about the Australian mafia. John was really at the forefront of that in rallying support for Julian right from the very get-go. He was invaluable to us as Julian's legal defence team at the outset in garnering that support and continued to be. So I really want thank you for raising him, and I'm sorry he's not here with us. The appeal this week is Julian's last appeal in the United Kingdom, and we're seeking permission to appeal. So you'll remember we won the case back in 2021 on the narrow grounds that Julian's on the basis of that it would be oppressive to extradite him because of the particular prison conditions he would face, the oppressive, darkest black hole of the US prison system, prison conditions he would face, combined with his mental health picture, depressive illness, and autism diagnosis, that he would be caused to commit suicide. That is the accepted medical evidence before the courts of this country that if he's extradited to the United States, it will cause his suicide. It couldn't get more serious than that. The US then offered an assurance, a conditional assurance, which is, even an assurance is not worth the paper it's written on from the United States, as Amnesty says, and then in this case it was conditional in that at some point in the future they won't put him in those particular prison conditions, but they will do if he does anything to deserve it, and the people who decide that are the intelligence services who wanted to kidnap and kill him. So the intelligence services who have the power, who wanted him dead, have the power to put him in prison conditions that will cause his death, and we have no ability to judicially review that. Nor did the British courts in this country allow us the opportunity to test that assurance before the court at an evidential hearing. So it's extradition by diplomacy. That's where we got to. We're now appealing the decision to extradite him on that basis. We're appealing the Home Secretary's decision and the decision of the district judge to all of the grounds that we lost at first instance. So you'll be hearing from us this week on free speech. This is an unprecedented prosecution. The Espionage Act has never been applied in this way to a publisher and journalist. The fact the US is exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction over Julian as a journalist who was publishing information outside of the US and yet will not give him constitutional rights at the same time. The fair trial aspects of it, that he won't get a fair trial if returned to the US. The fact that once extradited, the US could add additional charges that could expose him to the death penalty. These are the arguments you'll hear this week, but if we are unsuccessful in getting permission on even one ground, that's it. This is his last appeal in the United Kingdom. We will not be going to the High Court. We will not have recourse to the Supreme Court. Our last attempt at appealing to protect him from extradition is the European Court of Human Rights. And to say a quick word about that, if we lose this week and we have to go to the European Court, it is not a given that we will get provisional measures to protect him from extradition. It is an exceptional measure. There were 63 similar type applications made to the court last year in deportation and extradition cases. One was granted. And we all know what happened when that one provisional measure case went forward in Rwanda, the political backlash that we saw in this country towards the European Court's jurisdiction. So Julian could be extradited, and very soon. And that's how serious it is right now.
You have a law degree, come on.
Well, I mean, I think the big picture here is that Julian hasn't even been able to appeal. It was his permission to appeal that was rejected, and that's the decision that we're trying to overturn. The High Court, which is the second of 3 levels, didn't even want to hear his arguments. We put in an application that was 152 pages long, and it was rejected in a 3-page decision, which didn't engage with any of the arguments, simply said there was no arguable point of law. Julian should have been granted an appeal on each of the points that we raised, and none of them were granted, and it was dismissed in a very disturbing manner. And one has to understand that this is a political case, that the courts are not behaving in a predictable manner. In fact, we have to prepare for the worst case scenario. There's no point preparing for an optimistic scenario, because when you consider what an optimistic scenario would be, i.e. him winning this round, it would only mean that the court has agreed to hear an appeal on one of the points or several of the points, and many more months, if not years, in Belmarsh prison.
It's punishment by process.
Stella, just if you could run through quickly the litany of legal anomalies that have defined this process from the beginning, any one of which should see this case thrown out of court. That's what's always stung me, starting with UC Global filming or recording the meetings with attorneys, destroying attorney-client privilege. In any court of law in Great Britain or the United States, that's it. The try is, and yet they just violate their own rule after rule after rule, and that has always struck me. I don't know whether to call it farce or pantomime or what. It's a show trial, and when you get into those details, which maybe you can just lay out a few, it becomes completely apparent that this is not a legitimate judicial process.
I think that's absolutely correct. It is pantomime. Julian's imprisonment is done through legal sleight of hand. The extradition itself doesn't deal with the merits of the case. We can't interrogate the veracity of the statements of the prosecutors, who have completely misrepresented WikiLeaks activities and actions in publishing. They've brought in Espionage Act prosecution, for goodness sake, for the most important material that journalism has ever seen, as a compendium of state illegality and torture and systematized arbitrary detention and civilian killings and the horror and catastrophe of the Middle East, of the wars in the Middle East. So this prosecution should never have been brought in the first place. But once it's brought, it's a bit of a trap, because once you engage in speaking about the process, you sort of legitimize it as you go along. You're caught in well, surely he'll face a fair trial. Hold on, he can't possibly face a fair trial if the case should never have been brought, because what the United States is doing is criminalizing journalism, and there's no public defense, and there's no, so it's kind of channeling Julian into a state of perpetual defenselessness, and this is kind of the some of the difficulty that we face, that the violations are so egregious that you're not even speaking the same language. The spying on Julian's legal meetings with his lawyers, discussing his defense strategy and so on. His legal documents were shipped off by Ecuador to the United States. The plans to assassinate him, and it's met with non-engagement, because it's just so it's so extreme. So in a way, when I'm asked about the process, or what happens next, or what happens once he faces trial in the United States, it's like, for goodness sake, he's facing 175 years. Who can entertain the argument that he could possibly face a fair trial under any circumstances, if you take that even in isolation? So this is a bit of it's kind of a little bit like when Julian was inside the embassy, and I thought, how do you possibly translate the situation in a language or in a way that people just walking down the street would understand and believe? I think we've got through a set of pretty extraordinary things that have happened, whistleblowers in Spain actually giving physical evidence of what was going on inside the embassy to Spanish police, who then raided the security company, obtained hard drives with conversations with Julian and his lawyers evidencing this, and then emails with instructions from the United States in English talking about how to spy on Julian without the Ecuadorians knowing, and just such a huge body of evidence to show that this was actually happening, and then an investigation in the US that then prompted this disclosure about Pompeo plotting to assassinate Julian, and then the lawsuit now against the CIA, which the CIA is trying to shut down by invoking state secret privilege. So it's quite extraordinary, really, that we have a case where we know so much. But translating that into a way where that public awareness is really there, that's the challenge.
Well, overall, Dr. Kristen, I think the problem with translating it into public awareness is that the press has not done its job.
That's pretty obvious. They have come around a little bit in the lead up to these 2 days. There seems to be awareness now that this is about them. It's about their work environment, and they seem to care about that. But you have to remind them this is not about journalists, it's about journalism. And in the end, of course, it's about people's right to know. And that realism is sort of slowly getting there, I feel. So I'm really hoping that the focus tomorrow and Wednesday will be on the court. As Juan said, it's very important that the courts will be scrutinized and the proceedings there. And mind you, I have to mention the fact that journalists are having a really hard time actually getting access. Live streaming from the court is denied to everyone who is outside England and Wales for some reason. So it's like they don't want the scrutiny. So the realization is there. They've been constantly trying to block access. Reporters Without Borders have mentioned the case of Julian Assange as the worst case that they've been trying to monitor in any country. I mean, they've been going to Turkey, other countries. The problem of being an NGO monitoring the Julian Assange case has been bigger and worse than they've experienced in all these other countries, which speaks volume about the case and the entire thing. Yes, of course, journalists should have been more agile and scrutinized the entire thing. And we're still seeing popping up. We're still having to shoot down misconception and part of the slander that went on for years and years and years. Just this morning, I saw a legal expert on one of the television stations here in the UK talking about the so-called assurances or something that was something to hang your hat on. A law expert. And for heaven's sake, Amnesty International scrutinized it, and as Jen said it was not worth the paper that it's written on. It's basically assurances that they will treat him fairly. It's a statement. It's a diplomatic statement. It has no bearing in the US. And the Bureau of Prison in the US is notoriously independent. John Kiriakou, the CIA whistleblower, told me the story that, when the judges, in his case, when he did a plea pardon, a deal, recommended he would be put in open prison for the short period of time that he had to serve. The Bureau of Prisons said, well, we don't care what the justice says, we're independent. The only organization that has a say in how Julian is treated in the US prison is the CIA. The very agency that was plotted to kidnap and assassinate him. That's how severe it is. So this document, the so-called assurances, is worthless. And I must say that from a judicial perspective, I'm not a lawyer, but from a common sense perspective, to be allowed, even in an appeal court, without sending the entire case back to, if it was so important, it should be heard entirely on a lower stage, because it changed everything. To overturn a decision on the basis of this piece of paper just shows how utterly bent the system is, and how you just cannot rely on it. And I've lost all faith in it, I have to say. The only inkling of a chance that these two judges will overturn a decision of their colleague is if there's a powerful public pressure, powerful scrutiny, and of course that possibly the politicians will wave their hands and say, no, we cannot go any further. It's becoming an embarrassment to this country, which it is. It is an embarrassment to this country that Julian Assange is lingering in Belmarsh prison for almost 5 years.
I want to ask you about the CIA in Vault 7, because I think that was a turning point, but I met Julian through Michael Ratner, who was representing him. Michael was a very close friend of mine and a wonderful human being and just a courageous lawyer and amazing guy. But he always told me, and he was the one who got representation for the people in Guantanamo. I mean, he just had this long, amazing career. But he said, it's without the people in the street, I can't do my job in the courtroom. I can't. There has to be that pressure to essentially wake the judicial system up. I want to ask, and I'll start with you, Kristen, about Vault 7, because the Obama administration decided not to ask for Julian's extradition for what they call the New York Times problem. The New York Times problem, which was the Guardian's problem, and El Pais's problem, and Le Monde's problem, and Der Spiegel problem, is that in partnership with WikiLeaks, they published the same documents. And that's why we had all this charge, that false charge, that Julian was trying to assist Chelsea Manning with getting, because they needed something else. That changed after Vault 7. The Trump administration crossed the Rubicon. Instead of charging whistleblowers who had provided information to the press, and Obama was very aggressive about this, the Trump administration charged a journalist with espionage. Just explain, I mean, it's always my reading that that the engine now behind the extradition is the CIA. Explain what happened with Vault 7 and how things changed after Vault 7. Why don't you start, Kristen, then maybe you all can help.
I think you're correct in that evaluation. This is the driving power behind this persecution of Julian now is the intelligence community or the military intelligence interest in the United States. These are the powers that want revenge, and they want to see him dead. It's as obvious as that. The Vault 7 release, which was exposing the cyber tools of the CIA, how they could basically break into your telephones and your cars, computer system.
Even when they're off.
Sorry?
Even when they're off.
Even when they're off, yeah. And was obviously had a public interest to expose that this was in their arsenal. It was the most embarrassing leak in CIA's history, and the fury was obvious. And you have to remember that at that time, Mike Pompeo was the director of CIA. This is in the early years of 2017. And shortly after, in his first public sort of speaking engagement, he went to the podium and talked about the gravest danger facing the United States of America, which was Al-Qaeda and WikiLeaks, the journalist organization and Al-Qaeda. And it's then when he carefully turned to this definition of WikiLeaks, and we didn't realize that at the time. I did not realize how serious this was when he said this is WikiLeaks is a non-state hostile intelligence service. everybody dismissed it as being sort of hot air at the time, but it was not. It was the lawyers came up with as a legal definition that they could hang their hat on in their assassination plot, because you can kill a foreign agent that is hostile, right? That's what CIA does. It kills people, right? So, and of course later that plot was realized and discussed in the highest chambers of power in the White House, and given a go. So that was a turning point. And I think that this is still the power that we are facing, more so than President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, or Attorney General Garland. It is that power, you know more about the details of how that works on the inside. I don't know fully the entrails of it, but we have past history to rely on to see what effect it can have. So that is, in my opinion, the dynamics and the politics that is pushing this case, and the reason why we have Julian Assange as a political prisoner here in London.
Just to add that the Trump administration was actually very, very transparent about the shift in their, I forget exactly which document it was, but it was kind of their national threat framework type, the way we see the next 5 years. And they identified hacktivists, leaktivists, and public disclosure organizations as their greatest threats. And of course, Julian and WikiLeaks fell into the third category as a threat model to the Trump administration, public disclosure organizations.
Basically mentioning pillars of democracy as a threat to the administration.
Well, just on the CIA point, I will never forget getting off a plane in the United States to reading Mike Pompeo's comments, and it was immediately clear to me what they were doing, which was to use these semantics to create a new category for WikiLeaks that would allow them to pursue WikiLeaks in a different way. And it's similar to the kinds of semantics we saw around Guantanamo Bay. And thank you for mentioning Michael, who's a dear mentor of mine. It's a sad reflection of how long this case has been going on, that we've lost so many friends along the course of it. Michael Ratner being a really important one to me and to Julian. But as soon as Mike Pompeo made that statement, I actually gave a speech with the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, at UCLA later that day. And I stood up and said exactly that. This is exactly the kind of semantics we saw the Bush administration engage in around Guantanamo about unlawful enemy non-combatants. These new phrases that did not exist under humanitarian law, which were invented to lock up people in Guantanamo for a really long time. And when I heard this language, I immediately said, they are going to use this to pursue WikiLeaks. This is a new kind of language which they will use to make it possible to prosecute Julian and to cross this threshold. I used those phrases in front of the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and within days, Jeff Sessions, the then Attorney General, came out and said prosecuting Assange is a priority. And that's when the drums really started beating for this indictment. So I think we have to look at this indictment, and we tried to argue this before the court action, the extradition case. This indictment was driven after the CIA publications. They're prosecuting him for what happened before, but the impetus to prosecute him came under Trump after WikiLeaks published the CIA publications. And Mike Pompeo was gunning for this.
I want to ask about the British courts. So within the American court system, the CIA is virtually untouchable. They have all sorts of legal mechanisms, anti-terrorism laws, SAMs, immunity, everything that essentially makes them untouchable. But we see, and I think all of you are right, that this is being driven. How do they exercise that kind of control within the British court system?
I'm not sure to say that they exercise that kind of control. What's been concerning is the way in which the court rejected our arguments about abuse of process, raising these issues. So I was spied on as a lawyer. I've seen recordings through the context of the Spanish criminal proceedings of my meetings with Julian, videos and recordings of my legally privileged meetings with him. I have had to sue the British government for spying on me, which they settled. not just spying on me, but spying on me and information sharing with the United States as a result of the Snowden disclosures, which they settled. But if we look back historically, for example, at the prosecution of Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers leaker, he was a whistleblower, not a publisher, but prosecuted under the Espionage Act under Nixon. What had that case thrown out? Breaking into his psychiatrist's office. That was sufficient under the Nixon administration to have the entire case thrown out with prejudice, which meant they could never bring it again. In our case, spying on Julian's medical appointments, spying on us as lawyers, seizing legally privileged material, the list goes on and on and on of the abusive process. And what does it say about our democracy today that us raising these arguments went nowhere in the British courts, and that this prosecution continues in the United States when there's been far more abuse than what we saw under the Nixon administration? What does that say about our democracy today?
Well, I'm curious because it's just a given within the American court system that the CIA is untouchable. And is the British court system now so decayed that it just bows to any form of pressure, or is it replicating the kind of power the CIA has within the American court system? I guess I'm asking a question about what is happening within the British judicial system in terms of it's clearly dancing to the tune that they play, and I guess I'm asking why. Is it just because the whole system is decayed? Is it? I mean, the American judiciary is, not in good shape, of course. But it's just, we know as a reporter, you can't go up against the CIA. What's happening internally, as far as you can tell? I guess I'm asking both of you here.
Well, I think things are a lot more open in the US than they are in the UK. Just beginning with a cultural skepticism of too much state power. Even in popular culture, when you see the intelligence services portrayed here, they're usually portrayed as competent, admirable, honorable, all these things. Whereas, yes, there's some of that in the US, but I also see a lot of popular culture where the CIA are the bad guys. You don't have that so much here. I think things are a lot more sewn up here, I think. And it's less transparent. Starting with Declassified has done a lot of work looking at the judges involved in this case, and I have to be careful with what I say because we're going before the judges tomorrow. But have a read. There's it's very small. It's a small world at the top of the establishment here. And it's very integrated, and Julian offended all those networks. So I think there's some of that. And then there's also kind of a practical aspect, which is in extraditions, it's 99% politics. If this were a Russian extradition request, it would have been thrown out from the get-go. It wouldn't have been certified. A journalist publishing evidence of war crimes committed by the state in the context of a war, and then the Espionage Act being used for receiving, possessing, communicating information about war crimes to the public received from an insider who was a whistleblower. I mean, you can't even, it blows your mind to even transpose that situation into a different country. But of course, it's the United States. And there are all sorts of internal arguments that are involved. Like, of course, we have to trust our close, friends in the United States and the integrity of the judicial system. And if there was intelligence interest in Julian as the judges kind of referred to the CIA assassination plots. Intense interest, of course. Then we're not going to question that. And so it's just kind of they revert to a formulaic get out because they're our friends, and our friends are fair democracies that don't do bad things. And of course, everything we know contradicts that, right? Beginning from the torture program to black sites to Guantanamo Bay and so on. Like this is a country that has found a million different ways to break the law and to break international law and undermine the international legal system and to torture and to kill and so on. That's who we're dealing with, but you're dealing with a kind of dual register.
And to a certain extent, I wonder how much of it is careerism. They know if they render the decision that the state wants, it's very good for their career. And we have seen judges, I think of, known the Attica uprising is in the UK, but there was, those who stood up for, this was broke into a prison, killed 39 shot dead guards and prisoners. And, but judges that their careers were destroyed. And Declassified has, as you point out, detailed the links with the defense industry, and so it's a select group that is embedded within the intelligence services and the defense industry, but also they know the cost. I don't know what you think, Jim.
All I'll say, as counsel who will be in court tomorrow,
Okay, I'll say.
is that those who end up being appointed to the judge are typically establishment, to end up in a position where you're appointed to be a judge. And so the judiciary tends to be rather conservative.
Let's talk a little. I want to talk a little bit about the press, and I think following this over the years, and I just want to say, coming out, I worked 15 years for the New York Times. Coming out of that culture, for people who don't come out of those institutions, it should be clear that from the inception of the 2010 Iraqi war logs, those within institutions like the New York Times loathed Julian Assange because he shamed these institutions into doing their job. And they had to print that material because if they didn't print it, they would be exposed as lapdogs to the elites and stenographers to those in power. And this has traditionally been the case. So that's why, and I've heard people raise it, after this information was published, you saw the first, probably, institutions that began this long character assassination were The Guardian, The New York Times, my old editor, Bill Keller, and others. And this letter, which is good, that was published by Le Monde, and my understanding is that was pushed on them by the lawyers who said, this is not to call for Julian's release is suicidal. If Julian is extradited, if he is found guilty, then, and I published classified material in the New York Times, just to possess classified material, much less to publish it, it becomes criminalized. It's the death of investigative journalism into the centers of power. It's over. It's finished. But I want to talk a little bit about the consequences for the press from this case, and I think that is what got a lot of us initially who saw it behind it. let's talk about, God forbid, let's say Julian is extradited, let's say he is found guilty. What does that mean for the press? And just one more thing, watching it from the United States, you're watching a journalist who's not American, WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication. He was not leaked the materials in the United States. And it's this message that you can seize a journalist, no matter who they are, no matter what nation they're from, no matter where they are, and through what the euphemistically called extraordinary rendition, I think the consequences for the press are absolutely terrifying. And maybe we can start with you, Kristen, and everyone can address that issue.
Yeah, I mean, the precedent being set is dawning on journalists slowly, gradually. And it is the reason, of course, when we had rather a turnaround into support by our former media partners back in 2010 and 11, the New York Times, the Spiegel, and the Guardian, and others who were part of that media alliance pushing out publishing the Iraq war logs and the diplomatic cables and the Afghan war logs earlier. It's out of self-interest. It is dawning on them, and the precedent is extremely serious. And for some reason, for example, here in London, we had a meeting last week with the Foreign Press Association with over 100 journalists. The foreign press in this country seems to get it more than the local journalists for some reason. They do understand, even coming from countries with shakier past and dictatorships and living memory like Latin America, they do understand what this means, and it is serious, and that is this precedent is so chilling. But we're always talking about what if he is extradited, and I just want to mention the fact that the persecution of Julian Assange has already had a serious chilling effect. And it has already set an example for others from less democratic countries or dictatorships to go after journalists. We do have examples from China, from the Azerbaijani president, and from Russia, where they cite Julian Assange as an example. Why do you think you can criticize us when you have Julian Assange sitting in prison? This is the exact word of the Azerbaijani president who shot back and fired back at a BBC reporter. How can you criticize me for lack of press freedom when you have Julian Assange in prison? So that is the bad inspiration they get. And you have Evan Gershkovich sitting in prison in Russia, being charged with espionage. What is the difference between Julian Assange and him? And so Julian Assange is a prisoner, a political prisoner. And we saw on Friday what can happen to political prisoners in other countries. So it's a serious matter. So I feel that throughout this long saga. It's 13 and a half years since we were here actually in this club, preparing the release of the Afghan War Diary. The chilling effect that the persecution of Julian Assange has already had. You've seen raiding even in the ABC offices in Australia. They demanded access to a computer to try to find a whistleblower. Unprecedented. So the examples have been piling up. The damage has already been done, but the full damage will be done if he's extradited. So it is so important then to put the line in the sand. This needs to stop here for it to be reversed.
Just to reiterate what Kristen said, this precedent means that any journalist anywhere in the world who's publishing truthful information about the United States could be extradited to be prosecuted in the United States for publishing that information without constitutional protection. And that is a terrifying precedent. So, and it's not just about what, as Kristen said, it's not just about what it means here. And we've seen ads placed in the newspapers here by the unions and free speech groups saying the UK is no longer a safe place for media workers because of the extradition case against Julian. But it's what it says about to the rest of the world. As Kristen said, it's diminishing the moral authority of Western liberal governments to raise free speech concerns, but it's also putting people at risk elsewhere. And I want to recognise Can Dündar, who's here, a Turkish journalist who was imprisoned in Turkey. He was explaining to me, we talk a lot about this. So we talk about the fact that Evan Gershkovich is in prison and Putin says, well, when Blinken's saying you can't prosecute a journalist for espionage, he should be released. And Putin says, well, what about Julian Assange? Similarly for Can in Turkey, when he was imprisoned, Julian's case was raised and used as an example by the Turkish authorities about why they can do this. And so this is not just about Julian's case, it's not just about the cases that will happen in the future, but it's about what's happening in other cases in different jurisdictions around the world and the precedent that's being used to justify this kind of treatment to journalists. I think we've crossed a threshold beyond which there's no going back if this case goes ahead. And it is a terrifying precedent. And it's frustrating to me because, as Kristen said, we have been standing on this stage, and thank you to Vaughan for hosting us over the years, making these points, saying, stand with WikiLeaks because this will affect you. This will affect you, and if you think that this precedent won't be used against you, you are naive. It took until President Trump calling the media the enemy of the people for the press to suddenly wake up to what was happening. And the years that were spent othering Julian and WikiLeaks, trying to put them in some other kind of category, when they are all engaging in journalistic activity, you cannot distinguish between what Julian Assange and what WikiLeaks does and what the rest of the media does. You cannot distinguish. And if you think that you can other them over here and somehow, by doing that, you have shot yourself in the foot and your own protections. As far back, national security journalists have got this from the beginning. I remember being in the US at Chelsea Manning's pre-trial hearing, and the national security journalists who were there covering it were saying to me, Jen, this is terrifying. This is going to chill national security journalism altogether. And they were right. But they were across it. And it's taken a really long time for the media to get on board. I think the failure of the media to get on board earlier is what made it politically possible for the Trump administration to indict Julian. But now we need a really big push to stop this because it's not just about Julian. It is about what it means for journalists everywhere, for journalists who are in prison in Russia, for cases like Jan's. We have to stop it.
I don't have much to add other than it's a race to the bottom, the media has played a very bad role in keeping people ignorant, really giving them completely misleading information so that they don't have the elements to really understand it. The othering of Julian and WikiLeaks and not really engaging with the indictment itself. I mean, you still have to, correct journalists who say, "Oh well, this is about hacking," and it's just like how many years of and how many articles and how many explanations and how much debunking do you have to do to to get through to them? But sometimes I think it doesn't really matter. There are some journalists that are going to be hacks, and arguments are just kind of deployed as weapons. And if you shoot that weapon down, they'll just come up with another. And it's just positional. It's just basically projecting their alliance to power, basically. And in fact, those specific journalists who are hacks don't want to hear they don't want to engage. They're not interested because they see their role as furthering the interests of that power.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Unfortunately, elite institutions like the New York Times, it's a fairly high percentage, and it's not just furthering the interests of power, it's furthering their own careers, because that's how their careers advance. And if they actually do journalism, they become a management headache.
Yes, I was confirming in my formative years, I still revere the New York Times for the role in the Pentagon Papers, which we mentioned here, Daniel Ellsberg. May he rest in peace. He came over here in 2010 in October for the Iraq release, and I met him at the home of Gavin McFadden, another great supporter that we miss greatly, that has passed. And I recall how energized he was, and like in his 20s, he was running up and down the stairs, and he just couldn't control himself and saying, "I've been waiting for this for 40 years, finally. And he couldn't sit down, he just got a plane from America. He just was so energized by what was going on. He was so supportive. But he told me as well, if I was going to the same thing as I did in the 70s, 71, I would never have seen, in the today's system, I would have never seen a single day as a free man. We have totally changed. And it was an eye-opening for me that we were at a worse state than in the darkest hour under the Nixon administration. That's how corrupt the system is, and that's how lame the media is. And another issue that has been raised here was about the endless fight to correct the misconception, which comes even from our media partners who know better. For example, there was this irresponsibility about throwing out the information, data dumping, putting lives at risk, picking up the talking point of the Pentagon and the American administration. Nothing is further from the truth. Nothing is further from the truth. And before the publication of the Afghan warlogs, Julian was working tirelessly night and day to do harm minimization, redacting 15,000 of the entire documents with the Afghan warlogs. And Mark Davis, an Australian journalist and lawyer, was actually following him around in these rooms here, and the rooms that Juan supplied us. Thank you very much for that one. Have you paid the bill yet? No. And he has testified. He was witness to the fact that the media partners had no interest in the reductions. They thought it was a nuisance, that Julian was taking it too far. The same thing applied in the October release of the Iraq warlogs in a bigger media alliance, which I partly had to manage. It was like herding cats. We had to postpone a demand to postpone the release, and we did for 2 weeks because we were not finished with the reduction process. I will not. The trouble with pushing them to accept it, and they were actually threatening to go early without the raw documents. I called the bluff. You're not going to do that. You will never dare to do that. They were thinking we were going too far in that process, but the care that was put into the reduction in that Iraq warlogs basically got us criticism for over-reduction. Journalists were criticizing us. And then we can talk about the Capable Gate release, which was really a careful system. And then they take, these media partners and the journalists take part in echoing this irresponsible data dumping, where it was careful management of data with real responsible management of the material with a harm minimization process in mind, which went further than our media partner wanted, which went further than anything that I had experienced before as a journalist for 20 years in the mainstream media environment.
I just want to close before we open to questions. I think we can't leave without talking about the physical and psychological cost to Julian, which has been immense. I don't think very many of us, probably any of us in this room, could endure what he has endured and maintained his integrity and strength the way he has. I think Niels Melzer, what do you call it, a slow motion execution? It's just, along with the egregious violations of judicial norms, they have used the punitive power that they have, going all the way back to his 7 years in the embassy. And the reason he was 7 years in the embassy is because the British government would not allow him free passage to the airport. That's why he was there. And I guess, Stella, maybe you can just address that before we get questions.
Well, I think the massive impact this has had on Julian. It's been a constant decline because I really see it when I see footage from 5 years ago or 8 years ago, 10 years ago. I mean, the decline is steep, and he's aged prematurely. How could you not? We don't know the full extent of the impact on his physical health, his psychological state is a constant struggle. There have been very, very dark moments inside Belmarsh. And we're going into a very difficult week as well, which always comes with stress and sleeplessness and there's never a time of recovery in the middle of this. It's just one battle and then getting through it, and then decline, and a further battle and getting through it and decline. 5 years in Belmarsh is, no one can deny the harsh treatment that Julian is being subjected to just indefinitely into the future in the worst possible environment in the UK prison system. But he is helped by the enormous support there is, and the knowledge that support is growing, that there's initiatives all over the world, really. The Australian Parliament, honorary citizenships in Rome, the journalistic community in Europe, giving him, membership for the Bulgarian and the Serbian and the Italian and the German journalists union, declaring that he's one of them. All of these things are so important and keep him going, of course.
Great. So we can do about a half hour or so of questions. Just keep the questions short so other people can ask questions.
I was interested when you talked about all the redacting of documents, because I remember a few years ago, lots of newspapers were talking about this whole thing about irresponsible dumping, agents' lives put at risk. Is that rubbish?
Well, if you don't believe me, you should.
No. I'm not saying yours is rubbish.
Let me finish. You should believe the witness of the government in the Chelsea Manning case, who had to admit under oath that there was no evidence of anybody being physically harmed as a result of this release. And now, 13 and a half years later, 14 years later, we haven't heard of any damage. There was great effort put into this process, and to this date we have not heard anything. But it was a propaganda point. He's a hacker, irresponsibly dumping information on the internet. Nothing is further from the truth.
Thank you. I've got two questions. One of them, could you explain for non-lawyers why this case can't go to the Supreme Court. That's the first question. Second question is a bit more complicated. I noticed too, after the various judgments on the case, that if you look on social media, much of the response has come from, as it were, continental journalists, not British journalists, with a background in countries where lack of free speech is just about within living memory. If you look around the audience here tonight, this is a different audience from quite a few. When I come to the Frontline Club, if you come to something about Gaza, you will find that pretty much everybody is under about 35. Are you looking at, as it were, a free speech generation that has no successors? And do you think, and as a sort of sideline to that, do you think that the sex accusations from Sweden, did they have an effect on a particular generation that has maybe lingered? Thank you.
I'm happy to take the first question about the Supreme Court. We were refused permission to appeal. Basically, the High Court will hear, you don't get permission, you can't appeal as a right, you have to seek permission to appeal. We sought permission to appeal on the decision, for example, that the courts waved through the US assurance. I think that was a great point for the Supreme Court. They did not want to hear us. We now are waiting to see if we get given permission to appeal. It may well work its way up to the Supreme Court, and we think we have a number of really important legal points that deserve Supreme Court consideration, but whether or not we get there is a separate question. But if we're refused permission, that is it, and we have to go to the European Court. It's just the nature of the appeal process in extradition cases.
The honest answer to that is that The Guardian has played a very serious case for many years in undermining public understanding of Julian's case, and it goes down to the publication of Cablegate and the publication of the password that then led to the unredacted cables appearing online on a third-party website, and then The Guardian had to blame someone, and the evidence was there that it was in their book. They were to blame, and they deflected by smearing Julian and getting the other partners to smear Julian as well, essentially. And so without the liberal left, and of course the Swedish allegations were pumped up to play into that, and The Guardian gave it a lot of fanned that fire. It undermined political support. Also because The Guardian viewed Julian as a competitor, and WikiLeaks' reputation as an existential threat to the viability of The Guardian in the longer term. WikiLeaks came about at a time, and this is a more generalized problem, that WikiLeaks came about at a time when the mainstream press was struggling to find a viable funding model. And here came WikiLeaks, with much greater impact, with much higher quality sources, and basically blowing all these legacy media out of the water. So they had to destroy his reputation. So, you see all these unenthusiastic defenses of Julian. Like, oh, doesn't matter what you think about the man. All that is not just cowardly, but it's also to cover up for how they've engaged in putting him in prison, essentially. Dereliction of duty. Allowing their self-interest to making him pay with his life for their selfish self-preservation. However, I have to say, it's been late in the day, but they are on the side. You know, they've made this joint statement. They are clearly, saying Julian should be released. They have enormous influence, and so I don't, I pick my moments to really express what I truly think, which, of course, this will be there for posterity. So, but that's the truth. This hasn't come about by coincidence. This isn't a situation of Julian's own making.
Just on the Swedish stuff, you should read Niels Melzer's book on this.
I have read it. That's why I
Yeah,
asked
it's
the
great.
question.
And he's a lawyer, he speaks Swedish. And what's fascinating about Melzer is that he admits at the beginning that he fell for a lot of this garbage. I would just draw an analogy. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter, and Nader terrified the Democratic Party, and so they did the same thing to Ralph. And what they do is essentially create what Noam Chomsky calls these thought-terminating cliches. And then the press, which is, and I come out of the press, it's a superficial entity, uses these thought-terminating cliches as shorthand. And that became very effective in turning Ralph, who I think is one of the greatest American figures of the last generation, into a pariah. And they know very well what they're doing. And they did the same thing to Julian. But I think I don't know what Stella thinks, but I think Melzer's book is really, for people who really want to understand what they did, I think it's probably the best that I know.
There are also information in Stefania Maurici's book.
Yeah, hers is very good, but hers is different.
It's different, but she is exposed through her documents that she got through FOIA, how politicized the entire saga was, and it should have ended, in 2012 or 13, when actually the Swedes wanted to get out of it. This is absurd, and were pushed onwards by the Crown Prosecution Service in this country.
Yeah,
Wait,
Stefania's book is very good too, I should have mentioned.
I see Niels Melzer's book is a deconstruction, and Stefania Maurici's is a reconstruction with documents and forensic detail.
Somebody's got the mic? Okay. Yeah.
No, it's fine.
They're recording, so they want you to talk in the mic.
Question for Jennifer. Sam's the assurances that US sort of gave to Assange's legal team. That's not arguable. That's not an arguable point of law because they can always change them, right? Whereas Judge Berenice, she gave Julian a positive ruling that because on health grounds he may commit suicide. That gives more weight than the Sam's assurances, for example. So how come Julian doesn't win on that point? Because ECHR is only territorial in Europe. Once Assange goes to US, they don't have to listen to ECHR. Sam's will disappear overnight, so they can do whatever they want. So my question to you is that why wouldn't ECHR listen to Julian Assange's application on sort of health grounds, suicide grounds, for example? Because Sam's is not arguable. It's not an arguable point of law. It cannot be. It's not law. So why wouldn't they? And plus, this is the biggest case in publishing in the last 100 years, even 200 years. No one has ever done this. No one will ever do this. This is once, not in a lifetime. It's once in a generation. And I do disagree with you. I think they will listen, but it depends on how the application is put forward. And I really, really think this is the strongest point. Because in all the proceedings, this is the only point that has favored Assange. and that is Judge Vanessa's ruling on this. And she did a massive favor by them, because I believe that it was a conscious.
Okay, let's get Jennifer to respond, because other people want to ask
nice to
questions.
hear your view on that. Thank you.
Well, the first thing to say is that we did seek to appeal that point. As I said, we didn't get permission to appeal on the question of diplomatic assurance. That will absolutely form part of our European Court of Human Rights application. So that point was, as the lawyers in the room will know, we need to exhaust domestic remedies before we can apply to Europe. We exhausted domestic remedies on the point of the medical evidence about the impact of the prison conditions on Julian if he is to be extradited. That point is waiting in the wings, as it were. So once we've exhausted all domestic avenues of appeal on all the other points we have a European Court of Human Rights application ready to go, which will absolutely be raising those issues along with free speech, fair trial.
In the back, there's someone.
Thank you. Alexis de Soave, lawyer at the Brussels Bar and Vice President of the International Federation for Human Rights, the FITH, who came to London to support the case of Julian Assange because it's a human rights case and the defense of our fundamental liberties. My question is a legal question about the European Court of Human Rights. If we have to ask a Rule 39 to stop the extradition if the case is end badly here tomorrow and the day after, we know the UK government doesn't like the European Court for Human Rights, but do they respect the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights? We know other countries in Europe, Belgium, my country, extradited a person 10 years ago to the United States, despite the Rule 39 that forbid to forbid the Belgian government to do it, but they did it. What about the UK government? Do they respect it, or we don't know?
I certainly hope the British government will respect Julian's ability to apply to the European Court before extraditing him, and will respect any ruling of the European Court as it stands. But of course, we've been hearing some pretty concerning political noises from the British government, and it's certainly something that I hope the Australian government will be making clear its expectation that Julian, as an Australian citizen, will be allowed the available remedies under the existing law, which is that we should be permitted access to the European Court and be given time to do so.
Hi, my name is Chip Gibbons. I think some of you know me. My question is Vault 7 and how that sort of warped the CIA's perspective of WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence agency was brought up. A few weeks ago, the person who was convicted of giving Vault 7 to WikiLeaks received the longest sentence under the Espionage Act by decades in a civilian court. In seeking this sentence, the US government sought a terrorism enhancement under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and argued that his actions were more like people who gave evidence to hostile governments. They compared him to Richard Hannison and Aldrich Eames, two actual spies who were not charged under the part of the Espionage Act he was. Is there any fear that this sentence and this sentencing memo is about cementing the view of WikiLeaks as a sort of analogous to I know they're not, analogous to a foreign intelligence agency? And are we concerned with what that means if Assange is extradited to the US?
Well, of course, we have been watching those proceedings from a distance, and are worried about this length of imprisonment that the person got in this case. Stella, you were an opinion on this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the concerns that we're raising, one of the arguments that we're raising is that the U.S., once Julian is on U.S. soil, could seek to categorize the specific charges that he's been extradited under, and seek such enhancements including, of course, under the Espionage Act, there is death penalty under some of the provisions of the Espionage Act. And that could be done once he's extradited. I mean, once he's extradited, if he's extradited, anything can happen.
Yeah, I mean, technically they could add on to the indictment. They would only have to need a rubber stamp from London, which I suspect would be easy to get. Right, Jen?
Yes. I think you're absolutely correct, Chip, that this sentencing is incredibly worrying about not just because it was an alleged WikiLeaks source, so we're obviously following it very closely, but for what it signals about where the courts are going in terms of sentencing for Espionage Act offences. And so for the US, for example, in this case, the US made a representation in court that Julian would only face 5 years in prison, was the representation made before the court. That is absolutely not what the sentencing guidelines in Julian's case provide. We know that it will be significantly longer. And this latest sentence that's been handed down is incredibly worrying about where the courts are going and what Julian would face. Of course, we've never seen a prosecution of a publisher under the Espionage Act, but the fact that a source is receiving this kind of sentence is really worrying and terrifying for the United States.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I was just going to ask.
No, use the mic, it's a recording.
Yeah. Thanks. If Julian Assange is a spy, then who did he spy for? I mean, if I remember right, I think Chelsea Manning was charged with aiding the enemy, right? So I'm assuming, I don't really know the law, but you think that this is about providing information to a government. But if everything about WikiLeaks and if everything about Julian Assange is providing information to the public, then legally, can you not work it into the legal defence in some way, or can you not work it into the legal defence in some way that the government is declaring the public to be the enemy?
Just on the Chelsea Manning trial, which I sat through, the argument that the prosecution made was that by providing that information, it ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda, that it may not have been the intent, but that was the result. That was Chelsea Manning.
That's right. So the aiding the enemy charge in Chelsea's case came because she gave the material to WikiLeaks and WikiLeaks made it public. By that, because it was made public and made available to the public, it was also made available to the enemy. And you're right, it's a stretch, but this is why we say the Espionage Act was never intended. It's an antiquated piece of legislation dating to 1918, not intended to apply to publishers or journalists. There is no suggestion in this case that WikiLeaks was operating with the backing of or in support of a foreign power, which is the basis of what espionage is all about. Not at all. This is purely about publication. So the Espionage Act was never intended to apply in this way, to journalists or otherwise. So it's absurd.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if WikiLeaks was aiding the enemy, that must mean that the enemy is the people.
Well, it's not any one specific government anyway.
Oh.
You can pick.
Sure. Because I want to ask a question. Sorry, I apologize. My native language is Spanish, but I have 3 questions. The first one: how do you manage to keep in secret your relationship? Because you told that all the movements have been recorded. The second one, my second question is about how do you handle. Sorry, because I tend to see the legal framework from outside and from Latin America. And for me, I don't understand how it's working, this tradition in this country, because if you compare the Augusto Pinochet case and Julian Assange, I don't understand, I think it's political more than legal. Do you have any political support? Are you expecting any political support from here or from outside? And my third question, about the documents, can we expect maybe in the future to know all the content about the documents? Oh, I don't know. This is my question.
Well, keeping it secret from whom, I guess, is the question. We never assumed that the people who were surveilling Julian inside the embassy with sophisticated devices didn't know, but we tried our best to stay out of the places where there were cameras and I mean, Julian is a security expert, so maybe it's might seem extraordinary from a perspective of someone who leads a normal life, but you have to understand the context within that embassy was very very specific. Constant surveillance, but you find a way to live your life. I don't know what the other.
You asked a question about political support. We have been seeking the support of the Australian government for many, many years, and it's with this most recent government, under Prime Minister Albanese, we have the full support of the government. So it took a decade of lobbying in Canberra and an amazing amount of community support. There's some great community organisers in Australia who have been constantly banging down the doors of local MPs. When I go to meet ministers in Canberra, they tell me that their offices are blanketed with free Assange stickers, and people turn up at their constituents' offices asking them what they're doing, and it's made a difference. So just this past week, and I want to recognise Julian's brother Gabriel, who's here, who's been doing a lot of work in the Parliament in Australia and in the community organising space, not just in Australia but around the world. He and John Chipton, Julian's father. But we've just had a resolution in Australian Parliament last week passed by 2/3 of the Parliament, supported by the Prime Minister and the government, calling on the UK and the US to allow Julian to return home to Australia. And I can tell you that is a huge change. I used to address rooms of 3 MPs, briefing on Julian's case when I first started going to Canberra more than 10 years ago. And now when we go down, standing room only. We have support from every single political party. It is a bipartisan issue in Australia. So the leader of the Liberal Party came out and said that enough is enough. We support the government's position that this needs to come to an end. And the question is, now that we have the Australian government support, the Australian Parliament, the government, the Prime Minister, the government, the Parliament, the people, what will the US do with that? We have a special relationship. What does that special relationship mean? And if we look historically, with the support of the Australian government, for example, there was an Australian in Guantanamo Bay, David Hicks, who was accused of terrorism offences. A Conservative Australian government under John Howard negotiated his release and return to Australia. And what I continually have been saying to Australian governments of both political persuasions and to this government, if we can negotiate the release of an Australian in Guantanamo Bay, then why can't we negotiate the release of an award-winning Australian publisher? And I think that's the question, and I think it's a test of the Australia-US relationship now.
It's worth mentioning that, of course, the importance of the support of the Albanese government, the Australian government, and the bipartisan support that we now have in Australia is extremely important. But the support has also come from other countries outside the bubble of the NATO bubble or the AUKUS bubble.
Five Eyes
bubble. From Latin America, for example, where the presidents of 5 countries have issued statements, met us, Obrador in Brazil, in Mexico, Pedro in Colombia, Lula in Brazil, and Kirchner and Fernandez in Argentina, who are now left. And the Bolivian president, Arce, it's wonderful. I traveled to the region and it was astonishing to see the level of support, not just on the top level of politics, in all the major countries south of the US borders. in not just in South America, but 1/3 of North America as well. And President of Honduras, they raised the issue of the United Nations. Lula in General Assembly issued the questions of Julian in his speech there, the first speech there, and got an ovation, which is very rare in the General Assembly. So, and I don't know where it comes from, but my suspicion is that it's because of in living memory in those countries. You don't have to sell them stories about the capabilities of the CIA. They know, and they know dictatorships, and they know what it means to be deprived of human rights. And that is that continent, and in other countries as well outside this region, we've had tremendous support. But what does it mean in the end? Well, we see in the current conflict in that even though 150 nations unite on a single issue, like in the ceasefire issue in Gaza, it is not enough. But it is, in many ways, the support is huge, but we need more push. We need the public out.
Do we have time for like one or two more questions? Just two? It's up to you. Two more questions. I'll just let you, whoever you want.
Thank you, Jennifer, for mentioning my case. Well, I want to ask something about Joe Biden. I was jailed because of a news story I made in my paper. It was about Turkish intelligence service smuggling arms to Syria, to the Islamist jihadists there. And they asked 2 life sentences and put me in jail because of espionage charges and State Secrets Act, etc. And I was called as Turkish Assange by the Turkish media. There are a lot of similarities. I was in solitary confinement, and one day Joe Biden was in Turkey and wanted to meet with my family. My son and my wife met with him. And during that meeting, he said to my son that you can easily tell the reporters outside that your father is a hero and you must be proud of him. And he did this meeting. And the same Joe Biden now is trying to get the extradition decision from the UK. So what has happened? I mean, the same Biden, was it about, it was Turkish intelligence service, not the American intelligence service? Is that the reason why he was so, talked about heroism in journalism cases, or he changed during that time?
Can I start with Biden? It's what Chomsky calls this process of worthy and unworthy victims. So there were 4 stories in the New York Times about Navalny yesterday. There were none about Julian. And as a reporter, I think the Navalny story is important, and my suspicions are what everyone's suspicions are about what happened to him. But he's a worthy victim, and Julian is not. So these governments need that moral imprimatur, that moral veneer, and so they will use quote unquote worthy victims to give themselves that imprimatur while persecuting unworthy victims. And the starkest example in my own career, I covered the war in El Salvador for 5 years, and we had 4 American church women raped and murdered by the National Guard. We had Oscar Romero was assassinated. And at that same moment, there was a Polish priest with Solidarity who was killed, presumably by the communist government of Poland. This was during the Reagan administration. So you had church people killed in El Salvador at the same moment that you had a Catholic priest killed in Poland. All the Reagan administration did was talk about the Polish priest. And in fact, even though they were Americans, cast aspersions on the church women. Jean Kirkpatrick, who was at the UN, said they weren't really church women, and Alexander Haig, who was the Secretary of Defense, said that they ran a roadblock. So there's no moral crisis within Joe Biden. You were politically deemed a worthy victim, and Julian Assange is an unworthy victim. It's a very cynical game, but as a foreign correspondent for 20 years, I watched it play out over and over and over, so nothing happened to Joe Biden. He's the same shit he always was.
But thank you, John, for raising your case and pointing out the hypocrisy. And I think we have to continue to point out that hypocrisy, which is if you're willing to step in and help you be released from prison in such similar circumstances, then why are they doing this? And that's one of the things we continually do in our public advocacy, certainly in our public advocacy, is highlighting the hypocrisy of the United States in raising cases like yours elsewhere in the world, but doing it at home and doing this to Julian. So thank you for telling us about it.
Just a word about Joe Biden and hypocrisy and consistency. One of the biggest arguments in Julian's case is the fact that his extradition is in total contravention to the extradition treaty between the two countries, the US and the UK. Article 4, isn't it? It just totally bans extradition for political offences, and if any offence can be called political, it is a charge of espionage, right? So it should be impossible to carry out extradition on this basis. And it was pointed out to me, I was sent an article from the Belfast Times, pointing the fact that in 1984 or 5, then Senator Joe Biden felt so strongly about the political exemption in the extradition treaty that he fought tooth and nail against an agreement between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher for America to extradite a suspected IRA terrorist. So he fought in the Senate against it because the exemption was so holy as a rule that even the bad guys should not be extradited. It was a golden rule that should not be touched.
But he's Irish.
He was Irish, so he was successful in that. And this individual, I think his name was Wallace, was not extradited to the UK. So, and there are documents talking about this importance of this golden rule, and it's the United States who demands this exemption in all their bilateral treaties. So be consistent, Senator Biden, President Biden, and you don't have to do that, go that far. I mean, Biden was the vice president in the Obama administration that decided not to pursue. So, not to discontinue the case against Julian that the Trump administration started is a political decision in itself. Horrible one.
One last question. There's someone over here. You can decide.
Very easy.
Yeah, thank you. Andre Unko, I'm from the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. It's 3 times called for the immediate release of Julian Assange, and this assembly is linked to the court in Strasbourg. So I will come back to the question of the court. And I think we have to say very clearly, ignoring Rule 39 it's a binding law. The treaty is a binding law. Britain has signed it, and we should say very clear that this is a breach of international law if Britain would verily ignore Rule 39. I'm a member of the German Parliament as well, asked my government 2 weeks ago if the ignorance of Rule 39 would be seen as a breach of the European Convention on Human Rights, and my government said, yes, this is a clear breach, this is official, and we have to take into mind that the post-EU treaties, part of the post-EU treaties, are very sharply bound to the respect of the Convention on Human Rights. There is a phrase like this treaty, this part of the treaty shall cease if the Convention is breached. So this is, I think we should make it strong. I mean, I know that they are able to breach it, of course I know. But I think we should make it as strong as it's possible and not say, well, it's up to the British. I know that the Tories, they have a law now, they try to weaken it, but so far they respect it. They respect it in Rwanda, and we shouldn't. I just want to appeal that we should make it stronger and not weaken. My question to the lawyer: how do you see the binding character of the European Convention on Human Rights?
Of course, it's binding as a matter of international law, and of course, the UK should comply with any provisional measures that are ordered by the European Court. There's no question that that is our position. Our concern is the political noises that have been coming from the British government. And so we will continue to reiterate that the European Court is an avenue of appeal that is available to any resident, citizen, person in this country. And we will be exercising that available remedy, and we fully expect the British government to respect its international obligations and comply with it.
Great, thank you. I hope all of you will be outside the court tomorrow. We need to flood the streets. You make a difference more than you know. These people who are managing this deep down inside know how corrupt the system is, but it's you, all of us, who have the responsibility of calling them out. Thank you for coming.
Het gaat hier vandaag over saamhorigheid.
Dagje zonder hemel. Rustig, liegt niet. Wat normaal maken is wat niet normaal.
Every nation
maar blauwe lucht.
in every region now has a decision to make.
En dan ook geen hel meer.
You think I'm joking? Predator drones.
Dat is best makkelijk.
You will never see it coming.
Wat dacht je alle mensen?
Laat staan dat ik kan ingaan over vuur.
Bezig met vandaag.